There is a photograph in the collections of the Kansas State Historical Society that most people walk past without stopping. It was taken sometime around 1910 in a small train depot in the middle of the state. In the image, 12 children are lined up against a wooden platform railing. They are dressed in clean clothes, the kind donated specifically for this moment. They are holding small paper cards. The cards have numbers on them, not names. That photograph is one of hundreds like it held across archives in 30 states, taken between 1854 and 1929 at train depots, church halls, and county fairgrounds. They document the same scene repeated approximately 2,000 times across 75 years. A train arrives, children are unloaded, adults inspect them, children are selected, and the ones left over are loaded back onto the train and taken to the next stop. Official history calls this a humanitarian movement, the largest domestic child relocation program in American history, a rescue operation that moved 250,000 children from the streets of northeastern cities to farms and homes across the rural Midwest and West. The story goes that an idealistic reformer named Charles Loring Brace saw the misery of New York's street children and invented a solution. Farm families needed labor, children needed homes, and the railroad connected them. Everyone benefited. That is the story. What the archives actually show is something more complicated, more deliberate, and far more revealing about how American economic expansion was actually built. Consider a number, not the total count of 250,000 children, though that number matters. The number to focus on is 30,000. That is the estimated count of children living on the streets of New York City in 1854 alone. They were not all orphans specifically. The charity organizations of the era used the word loosely. Many had one living parent and some had two. What they shared was that their families were poor, recently arrived, and unable to fight the institutional machinery that classified their children as candidates for removal. Charles Loring Brace understood this distinction better than his published statements suggested. His private correspondence, held at the New York Children's Aid Society archives, is more candid than his published work. He described the city's immigrant poor, Irish and German families primarily, as producing a class of children that, in his framing, was becoming a dangerous population. They were dangerous not just because of crime, though he used that language too, but because they were unproductive. They represented, in his words, the waste of the city, human material going to ruin in the alleys and tenements when it could be put to use somewhere it was needed. That phrase, human material going to ruin, appears in his 1854 prospectus for the Children's Aid Society. It is not a slip of language, it is the operating framework. The program Brace designed was not organized around adoption. Adoption implies a legal process, permanence, and rights. What the Children's Aid Society established was called free homes, a placement arrangement in which a child was sent to a family under a loose agreement with no binding contract, no legal transfer of parental rights, and in the early decades of the program, no formal mechanism for the child to leave if the placement was harmful. In exchange for the home and board, the child was expected to work. The nature and extent of that work was left entirely to the receiving family. The receiving families were recruited through a specific and deliberate channel: advertisements placed in rural newspapers. These advertisements described the children in terms that were not incidental. They listed ages, described builds, and noted apparent health and strength. Contemporary researchers studying the placement records have noted that the language used to describe the older boys, particularly those between 10 and 15, reads almost identically to the language used in agricultural advertisements of the same period. Good, strong lad, accustomed to outdoor work, willing and capable, ready to earn his keep. The families were not screened in any meaningful way during the program's first several decades. Brace himself argued against formal vetting on the grounds that it would reduce the number of placements and slow the movement of children out of the cities. The practical consequence of this policy was that the organizations running the trains had no reliable way to distinguish between a family that wanted a child and a family that wanted a worker. The railroad companies understood what was happening, and they participated willingly. The Children's Aid Society negotiated reduced rates with rail lines operating the routes west. This was not charity from the railroads. It was a business arrangement. Settled agricultural land along rail corridors generated freight revenue. Families farming that land needed labor to produce freight, and children delivered to those families were, in the economic logic of the arrangement, a capital investment. The stops along the route were organized in advance by local committees, typically formed by the most prominent business and civic figures in each town. These committees advertised the arrival, arranged the venue, and managed what contemporary accounts describe consistently as an inspection process. Children were brought forward, and adults walked among them. They looked at teeth, felt arms, and examined posture. They asked about previous work experience and farm knowledge. Children who looked strong were selected first. Children who looked sick, small, or were very young were frequently left over. The children who were left over were loaded back onto the train. This detail appears so routinely in the historical record that it barely registers as extraordinary anymore. But consider what it meant to be a child on that platform, selected or not selected, watched or passed over, assigned a number, taken or left behind. The emotional architecture of that experience was total, reaching into the deepest possible layer of what a person believes about their own worth. Then, in most cases, the name was gone. Upon arrival, older children were routinely given new surnames, matching their placement families. First names were often changed as well, either at the family's preference or as a condition of the placement. The organizations that ran the trains kept records of varying quality, and in many cases, the original name, origin, parents, and family history of a child were simply not transferred with them. By design or by negligence, and the archives suggest both operated simultaneously, hundreds of thousands of children arrived in their new communities with no documented past. This was not a side effect of poor record-keeping. Brace had a theory about it. He believed that severing children from their origins, from their immigrant parents, their foreign language communities, their Catholic churches, and their urban habits was part of the cure. The countryside would remake them, the farm family would Americanize them, and the absence of a traceable past would free them to become something new. What that something new was in practice was a rural laborer who did not know they had the right to leave. The New York Foundling Hospital, a Catholic institution that ran its own parallel placement program beginning in 1869, operated somewhat differently. Its placements were more formally documented, its receiving families more carefully vetted, and its children generally younger. But it was not immune to the same pressures. When the Foundling sent 40 children to Clifton, Arizona in 1904, placing them with Mexican Catholic families because no Anglo families had applied, the Anglo community of the town forcibly removed all 40 children over the following days and redistributed them to Anglo families without the organization's consent and without legal authority. The incident went to court, and the Arizona Supreme Court ruled against the Foundling Hospital. The United States Supreme Court affirmed that ruling in 1906. The legal reasoning was not about the children's welfare, it was about race and community standards. The court held that the children who were white should be raised by white families regardless of the contractual arrangements their caregivers had made. 40 children were redistributed like misdelivered goods. The program continued for another 23 years after that ruling. It was not shut down because anyone decided it was wrong. It was phased out because the conditions that had made it economically logical had changed. The industrialization of agriculture reduced the demand for child farm labor. Immigration patterns shifted, and the cities developed their own institutional infrastructure for managing poor children. New federal child labor laws passed incrementally between 1900 and 1930 made the use of young children in commercial agriculture legally complicated. The orphan trains stopped not because of a moral reckoning, but because the market conditions that had created them had evolved. Charles Loring Brace died in 1890 and is buried in Westchester County, New York. The Children's Aid Society he founded still operates in New York City today, its current mission statement describing its work in terms of empowering young people and families to thrive. The founding prospectus, the one that describes human material going to ruin, is in the archive. Both documents carry the organization's name. The economic historians who have studied the orphan trains most carefully tend to arrive at the same conclusion from different directions. The children themselves did not drive the program. The program was driven by a specific and urgent economic problem. How do you populate a continent's worth of agricultural land fast enough to make the railroad investment profitable when immigration is not moving people to the right places quickly enough, and when you have in your northeastern cities a large and visible population of children who are not, in the language of the era, being used? The answer the era came up with was to move the children to where the work was, call it rescue, and let the receiving families determine the terms of the arrangement. Most placement families were not cruel. The historical record on this is more nuanced than either the defenders or the critics of the program wanted to be. Many children did find genuine homes, some found prosperity, and some found people who loved them. The records of descendants who have traced their orphan train ancestry describe outcomes across the full range of human experience, from warmth and gratitude to exploitation and lasting damage. But the program was not designed around any individual child's experience. It was designed around a supply problem and a distribution solution. The individual outcomes were incidental to the system's purpose, and that distinction matters enormously when you try to understand what the orphan trains actually were. Here is what the children carried with them, and what they did not. They carried their bodies, measured and evaluated at every stop. They carried whatever labor skills they had. They carried, in many cases, the trauma of being publicly inspected and selected or rejected in front of strangers. What many of them did not carry was a traceable name, a documented origin, a legal history, or any reliable way to return to where they came from. Those children grew up, had children of their own, and those children had children. There are an estimated 2 million Americans today who are descended from orphan train riders. Many of them spent decades trying to reconstruct what the program deliberately obscured. Researchers working with the Orphan Train Heritage Society have spent years matching fragmentary records, cross-referencing census data, and comparing photographs. Some of them find the original names. Some of them find nothing. The filing cabinets at the Library of Congress contain the WPA interviews from the 1930s. Government writers were sent into homes across 24 states to record the memories of elderly Americans before they were gone. Some of those interviews are with people who remember the trains, remember watching children arrive at their local depot, remember the papers the children held, and remember the way the adults walked among them. None of the interviewers asked the most obvious question. None of them asked what the children were thinking while they stood there. Nobody thought to record that, or if they did, it was not the part of the story the program was designed to preserve. The trains stopped in 1929. The last official placement was in Sulphur Springs, Texas. A child stepped off a train, was evaluated, was placed, and the program was over. The economic conditions that had created it had run their course. What was left behind were 250,000 severed histories, a continent of farms built partly on the labor of children who were described in their own records as having no names worth keeping, and a word, humanitarian, that covered all of it so completely that it took decades for anyone to look underneath. The photograph in the Kansas State Historical Society still sits in the archive. 12 children, clean clothes, numbered cards. They are looking at the camera. The people selecting them are standing just outside the frame. The train that brought them is behind the station wall, out of view. Everything that matters in the image is exactly what you cannot see. The numbers on the cards were not accidental. Names can be traced. Names connect to parents, to parishes, to ship manifests, to a point of origin that can be followed backward until you find the family that was separated. Numbers cannot be traced. Numbers belong to a system, and the system was not interested in origins. The system was interested in placements, in agricultural output per county, in freight revenue per rail mile, and in the productive yield of what Charles Loring Brace had, with genuine conviction, called human material going to ruin. The children in that photograph are all dead now. Their grandchildren are elderly. The records of most of their real names, if they were ever kept at all, are gone. What remains is the number on the card, the clean borrowed clothes, and the expression on 12 young faces that nobody at the time thought was worth writing down.